Good morning, everybody, and welcome to episode 5 of Stu and Coco. And we're joined by Simon Blair, principal owner of SHB Real Estate, obviously one of London's leading agents, both for tenants and landlords. Welcome, Simon.
Hi, Tony.
Simon, what we're going to be looking at today is we're looking at how the current COVID crisis is broadly affecting London's commercial and residential sectors, both in terms of values or how it may end up affecting when the market moves again.
Yep.
Both values and rents, right, and yields. Interestingly for me, what you're doing as an agent in the space in terms of evolving products and services.
Yeah.
And then I'm keen to see where you see us coming out the other side, and again, broadly, what your views are of how it looks in 2021 and onwards.
Yep, that's fine.
But yeah, kick us off with where you see the market moving in the short term.
I think at the moment, a lot of the subject matter around value is up in the air. We're in the middle. It's almost like the prelude to the recession and the downturn. We don't actually know, and this is across many industries that are being affected by COVID-19. We don't actually know how bad it is yet. All we know is that the very positive movement forward that we had before, which involved growth, fairly consistent growth over a number of years and months, has now stopped. We now know from a value point of view that any movement from occupiers en masse in a city like London has completely and utterly halted, even though lease events still carry on. What does that mean when we come back? It probably means that the impact on rents will be negative, so you'll see downward movement, and I'll come back to that. Rent-free periods and general incentives will start moving out. You'll have more space coming to the market as a result of tenants who have basically taken too much space in the past, or what was suitable for them in the past no longer being relevant. And the true extent of that, space coming to the market and how much it might be is yet to be seen. The very first thing, or the main thing, that landlords are going to protect amongst all of these things is going to be their rent profiles. If they start lowering their rents, they're affecting their, if they've got estates, they're going to be affecting via evidence, new evidence, the rent reviews, the new leases. A lot of these landlords leverage off the back of their buildings. So if you start lowering the rent profiles, they're going to be able to borrow less money. A lot of them have got payment, commitments to banks, which they'll start to not be able to hit, and they'll have to subsidize it from other places. So negative downward movement of rents is about, really is about as serious as it gets. So landlords will do a number of things first and exhaust a number of things first before they start to consider that properly. What we don't want to see, and I think unfortunately we probably will see this, is a rent profiles going from up here and dropping by 30 or 40% in a 12 to 24 month period. So the first things to go will be rent-free periods will go out, and depending where that is in London, every area is different. I think you'll start to see quite sympathetic movement like that. Already you're starting to hear about that in negotiations. There'll be little shortcuts, like, at the end of the lease, you might have your dilapidations removed completely, because that's a very,
easy fix.
It's an easy fix, but you're backdating the problem. So if the tenant is going, okay, well, I can see we're saving X amount of money at the back end, they can deal with that. You know what I mean? It's a saving is a saving if you believe your business is going to have enough longevity to make it through to the end of a lease. Beyond that, you're struggling, aren't you? So then you need then landlords are going to have to start getting real. And the problem with negative movement in rents is that when it starts, it's the same thing as upward movement. When it starts, it turns a corner, and we're hovering right now. We're holding, and it starts to teeter. And then when the evidence starts coming through, you have a choice between not letting your building at all for a long period of time, or predetermining the lower level. So if the market sits here, landlords will start to actually go below that to try and beat their own competition. So you end up with this negative climate where the market's kind of beating itself up.
Yeah.
And when we've been here before, it's very, these types of homegrown or more homegrown, home effective recessions that affect everybody nationally, they're quite systematic. Actually, the fact that there's a virus is merely the trigger, you know, and it's ultimately tragic that it's happening, but the cause and effect of the recession, actually, we've seen this many times. You know, we know how this goes. We just choose to sometimes forget and to think that maybe this generation is different.
It's completely new, new.
Which actually isn't. The virus is in our lifetime.
The trigger's unique, isn't it? The trigger's unique in our lifetime, but ultimately the process is the same. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, I think that's true. Now, what we don't know about that is how deep this recession goes, and most recessions have a beginning, a middle, an end, in very much the same way as a story. This one, because we're still in the middle of the lockdown, well, allegedly at the end of the lockdown, but nothing has got back to any form of normality, and probably won't do for quite some months. We don't know when the beginning of this true recession effect will kick in, you know, because you can't create the evidence until there's movement in the various markets. And you know, lease events don't stop, they carry on, that's true. So there's transactions happening on lease regears, negotiations due to COVID of rent-free periods that tenants weren't entitled to. You know, there are reasons for things to happen, but office moves, the only office moves that are happening right now are the ones that were predate Corona.
Yeah.
You know, and that's, landlords right now are trying to argue that there's a supply and demand issue still remaining in London that existed pre-Corona, and therefore that is the rationale behind the rent staying strong. But of course, the evidence that they're referring to relates to the deals that were agreed pre-Corona.
Pre-Corona.
Right.
And also, you know, we haven't mentioned this, but in terms of potentially seismic supply event,
right.
If there was a major landlord / serviced office provider like say a WeWork to fall over, which might suddenly flood, you know, London with 8 to 10% of extra space, you know, that's going to compound the issue.
I mean, the WeWork conundrum, you know, it's a very subjective discussion, that part of it, because it seems highly unlikely that WeWork would suddenly just collapse in the way that a collapse might indicate. That means that all that space would just flood to the market. You know, WeWork have instructed Knight Frank to negotiate on every single building that they have, right? So there are separate negotiations.
Well, in terms of the portfolio they own, or in terms of the portfolio they rent and sublet?
On everything, but mainly concentrating on the negotiations to do with reapproaching landlords of individual buildings as SPVs. So they're all individual entities where WeWork can go.
Oh, are they? I didn't know that. So every WeWork setup where they're effectively a tenant to a superior landlord is set up as an SPV.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Which is the model that's
developer model.
Know, it's a model that's been around for a long time.
Okay.
The way, I mean, it's a complex subject, and it's one that one has to be a bit careful with. But the way that works is that WeWork takes the building and puts it into the SPV. Let's say we have a situation like Corona, like this now, where the values that they'd agreed at the front end were whatever they were, they've been entitled to their rent-free period. And suddenly down the line, the building isn't performing. There's unlikely to be some kind of parent company guarantee in most cases. So that means that the SPV is literally just a holding entity. And WeWork or the service officing provider in question can just go to the landlord and you know, convey the situation as it is and the performance of that building and discuss what the options might be. and those options are likely to mean renegotiations of terms, to some degree. And the alternatives timeline is that if that SPV were in some future world to be, closed up and shut down, then the landlord would be left with a building that is, in this case, WeWorkified, with theoretically not very little idea about how to fill it, and that includes dilapidations and, what do you do with it? Do you have to take it back to Cat A? And these days, the gift that the service movement has given everybody is that landlords are very au fait now and developing quite quickly about understanding the positive impact of having a building that looks and feels like that,
Well, I think from my point of view, I think you've got a couple of things there. I think the first issue you've got is if you're a tenant looking to sign up with a WeWork type business and you know that there's financial concerns and therefore that they might not be able to honour their commitments to the superior landlord, why would you give a deposit? Why would you take space? Unless you can get some sort of guarantee from the superior landlord, or unless there's no deposit, right? And it's done on a very flexible basis.
It's a really good point. There are a number of providers, both on the management side, the management agreement side, that have emerged in recent years, and on the service side, and not just WeWork, across the spectrum of what service providers do these days. And I think it's now become clear again that the service model and the management model, to some degree, are quite weak business models. And the reason they're weak is that on one day a building can be 85 to 90% capacity full, and within
3 months down the line, it's empty.
3 months down the line, it's almost empty.
Yeah.
You cannot in any way predict income streams like that. Now it's incredible how we choose to, we've chosen to forget the facts that are right in front of us. But as a network or a community in surveying terms, landlords and developers, we have done, because the transactions were so, fluent. There were so many deals happening whilst WeWork were on the rise, and as a result of WeWork rising, there were so many other companies that were being created in
Me Too brands.
Yeah, absolutely, and just this movement in service was just extraordinary. And everybody was making money, everyone, other than the service companies, really, because their models just are, as I say, they're quite weak, and they've never really materialized to perform in the way that they promised that they would. When WeWork got floated, or attempted to
didn't
float, or attempted to float, the timing of it, you could argue it with any which way, but you could argue that the timing was slightly off. You could argue that actually people realised that floating concept like that on the basis of what they hoped it might become in the future just didn't wash anymore.
Yeah, for me, I thought, having a $46 billion valuation, trying to IPO twice at that level was just wholly unrealistic, and was borne out by SoftBank's acquisition of, controlling stake at whatever it was, 8 or 9 billion. Right. My question to you is this, though. Mm-hmm. We've talked about the threat to serviced office providers. We've talked about the kind of stack a house of cards piece, not creating real issues now for landlords, but also the threat to tenants, looking for space and wondering whether or not actually they should give deposits. The other interesting piece for me is a lot of these co-working spaces, in terms of the design of them, are obviously non-compliant in terms of COVID-19. So fundamentally, you might end up with a lot of space that isn't fit for purpose.
Yeah, a lot of the stuff that's coming out about what the office is going to look like when we come out of this, when we go back to whatever the word normality seems to mean these days. A lot of them seem to be highly unrealistic. And, there's a lot of documentation flying around. If you look on the various social platforms, and various companies are just flinging this data around. Everybody's become an expert in what the office will look like after COVID, has been, and people, start to pass, and we get used to being in the office again. But the fact is that a lot of it is wholly unrealistic and just isn't going to be possible to enforce. They're saying things like, individual people in lifts, at one person at a time, social distancing, moving around an office in a clockwise movement, working in different time zones. So you have one group of people coming in at one time, one group of people coming in another. These things are lovely ideas, but actually
practical.
They're not practical. I look forward genuinely to seeing how it kind of develops and falls out, because a lot of companies are starting to spend a great deal of money to implement these ideas, and they're entirely theoretical. If you think about the number of tower buildings in London, and they can't take the lift traffic that goes in them as it is, let alone
if it's two per lift.
Yeah, let alone if it's one or two people per lift. I mean, you look at buildings, the tower buildings all over London, things like, one of the most famous of which is the Shard. How are you supposed to deal with that? And think about the number of touch points in an office in a day. You're talking about people opening up fridges, touching door handles. You're talking about just generally just walking around or going to the toilet, going to the bathroom. How do you social distance in a bathroom? You've got cubicles for men, stand-up cubicles, you've got sit-down cubicles for both genders. But what are people supposed to do? They're supposed to disinfect the loo every time they go, because the tap's in there. It's just these things. I think when you really think about it and break it down, that's just in the office. It's very challenging what we're trying to achieve. So I'm not saying don't try and achieve it. I'm saying be realistic about what can or can't be done.
What you can achieve, and it's very much, and it does end up as a bit of a farce. You're in a supermarket, and there's social distancing on the way in, and there's social distancing on the way out. But when it comes to milling around the aisles, it's all a bit of a free for all. And I think I think where we'll end up is we'll probably end up in a similar type farce when it comes to coming back to work in the offices.
I think a certain amount of common sense has to be implemented, and you have to trust people to adhere to that common sense. But your reference to the supermarkets is a very good one, because you're quite right. It's almost like on the way in, the packaging, and the way out packaging looks really good, but actually when you get in internally, there might be a few dots with arrows on the floor, but actually, I went to the supermarket last weekend, and there were families in there, and everybody was chatting and talking, and it was a bit of almost like a social gathering. Social distancing, absolutely not. And I imagine, and who time will tell, that the office situation might be very similar. You'll end up with people going in very, with great spirit to do the right thing, but actually to do your functional job and be part of a company's existence as a brand, involving collaboration and growth and intellectual discussion, and having face-to-face meetings or not. Now, these are the things that you need to do in order to encourage positive growth in any way, shape, or form. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't really positive things that come out of this kind of lockdown experience.
Yeah.
The things like it transpires that actually people can be trusted to work at home. It turns out that all of the people who said that it just wasn't achievable were actually incorrect.
Yeah, and it was also a great time for Zoom to IPO.
Yes,
30 billion IPO. Yeah. Good one.
Yes, we work. That's how you do it.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the stuff at home, I mean, that there's obviously going to be some serious. I think some of the things will get back to normal, and the importance of brand is really something that's worth concentrating on, because some companies aren't that concerned about the brand growth and the integrity of brand. But a lot of companies are, because they that holds a great deal of power to work under this umbrella that does things around the concept of brand. And you can't you can't really do that effectively over a long period of time if half your staff are not present in an office.
I'd agree with you.
You need to culturally be together and do things in the same way. So it's not about micromanagement or anything like that. It's just about creating culture, which I think you'd lose if people worked
and it
at home all
boils,
the time.
for me, Simon, it's really simple. It boils down to the fact that we are social creatures. You know, there's very few, as a recruiter, there's very few roles that we hire that don't involve a serious level of social interaction, face-to-face meeting. You know, you know, if you're an estimator, fine. But other than that, there's, you know, there's very few peculiarities where people work better from home on their own, right? Or in a virtual type situation, as we currently have.
Well, certainly for a long period of time. I mean, I think I personally found one of the major positives is, you know, I've spent time with my family, which has been wonderful. But I've also I'm far more productive in the short term at home, working in a focused way than I am when I'm in the office, because the office, being these days, is popular to have open plan offices where everybody's quite close together. Often there are distractions and people are talking to you and asking questions, and that's fine. That's part of being in the office. But actually, to have some downtime where you're just with you and working from home is both very efficient, practical, but you know, a worthwhile thing to do from a mental health point of view, you know, for everybody's perspective. But to do it all the time, I don't think is going to work out for most companies.
Listen, I'm with you. I don't think this is going to long term revolutionise the office market. That's my personal view. I do think there's going to be a greater level of flexible working, but I don't think it will fundamentally change the demand.
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely right. And I think on that, where it might have an impact on the office market is that you know, I think people looking to move and relocate will probably think about how they use their space a lot better. And actually they might have flexible working rolled into that in a far more integral way, which means that ultimately they'll take less space.
But again, ironically, flexible working rather than potentially hot desking. Because I mean, personally, I'm finding hot desking, where you've got many people using the same space, presents its own issues in terms of COVID-19, right?
Of course, yeah.
Right. However, in terms of my demand for space, and we're only a small business, my demand for space probably won't have moved much, because in order to try and embrace social distancing, I can only import back half to a third of the staff I employ. Therefore, actually, my requirement for total space is probably pretty similar.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, because you're taking into account the COVID kind of precautionary level. Well, I mean, yes, okay, I can see your point.
Do you see what I mean? So short term, my need for volume is actually pretty consistent because of COVID-19, even though I'm deploying working from home.
Well, I mean, think about something you just said in there, which is definitely very current and fascinating, with a few things, and fascinating, is that we all appreciate and understand that we might be on the precipice of possibly the biggest downturn and recessional period that we've ever seen, you know, possibly in the history of economics in this country, right? And time will tell whether that's true or not. But on one hand, we're talking about people are going to have to start thinking about cost, and that involves costs on a human level to do with redundancies and you know, things like that. And then obviously you've got the cost of your offices and you know, the general cost of being a business and functioning. So we know that's happening, and we'll come back to the human element. But in terms of the physical and the office and things like that, what you're actually saying, and what they're trying to encourage us to think about, is that we take more space to accommodate, and more costs, therefore, on rent, rate, service charge to accommodate the COVID solution, which we don't actually really know, as many times as they'd like to say that they're following the science when they don't really know what they're talking about. We don't know whether that is adequate or not. And the fact is, companies just aren't going to do that. And they can't, not only are they not going to do that in terms of move to bigger offices to accommodate this, but most of them can't do that. because this is a time for reducing costs, not increasing it.
Or is there an argument that potentially one cancels out the other? Is there an argument to say that actually, because rents might drop 30-40%, but actually your demand for space might go up 40-50% because of COVID distancing?
Yeah,
you end up with a kind of leveling out in terms of your overall.
Yeah, it's a really good point, because if indeed that's true, then the thing that, I'll do it another way. The thing that everybody fears the most when it comes to these downturns from a property perspective is the period where nothing happens.
Yeah.
So the down movement, which we're not even in yet. Let's be clear about that. We're just in this holding pattern.
No movement.
No movement. Where the market's just been on. It's just on hold, basically. So we were at this level. We're on hold. We have no idea how bad the landscape, the damage to the landscape really is on all fronts, including retail values. What's going to happen to leisure and tourism.
We haven't even talked about the retail sector.
Yeah.
That's a whole different pain.
But this is unlike other downturns in recent times. This one affects every single element of our lives. Every sector. And we just don't know how bad it is. But when we go back to the markets and we get some kind of movement, we'll start to become clear. And what will make that become clear will be, the number of redundancies that come out of the furlough scheme, the number of businesses that actually do hit the wall, how deep people's pockets really are. Then you'll start to see this kind of downward movement and reaction. But that's not going to happen straight away. That's going to take 6, 9, 12, 18 months for that to feed through. So to landlords right now are claiming that and I understand why they're doing it, but they're saying that there's a supply and demand issue still in London that was, pre-existing the COVID virus affecting all of our lives. But and technically on paper, there is a supply and demand issue, but it's only a suitable argument for a period of time, because we don't have any rental or deal evidence as a result of COVID yet. To challenge that. So until we do, landlords are going to try and hold firm for as long as they can on their rent profiles, because they use those rents to leverage their buildings and pay off debt here, there, and everywhere. Any deals that they do act as evidence against other rent reviews and deals they do on their estates and with their fellow owners in the relevant markets. So it's going to take a bit of time. There are going to be loads of things that go out first, and there'll be things like rent-free periods, other methods of cutting costs for the occupier, anything to avoid lowering the rents. Anything,
and you would do for all as a landlord for all those reasons.
Perfectly natural. Yeah.
My question to you though is, how is SHB Real Estate? How are you guys tackling these challenges?
Well, I mean, the one thing that happened quite quickly, or became very clear, was that the moment that there was no question in our mind that as soon as the coming into London was unsafe, we said, right, everybody work from home. We were very lucky in some ways and quite organised subconsciously, because we work almost entirely off of platforms and CRM. We're very data led. We've got a very strong business development concept, and it can all work remotely. So within 2 days, we were as functional as we were in the office anyway.
Wow.
And it was amazing. We didn't know it was going to be like that, but it was. And we run a lot of analytics. We could micromanage people in teams quite closely, naturally. So it was a very natural thing to go from working in the office to working.
Well done, you. I'd love to say the same, but I can't.
Right. but it was more that we put in place these things through. We wouldn't know that this kind of thing was going to happen, but so it was more luck than judgment in some ways. Now, since then, the other thing that happened, as soon as the government implemented the furlough scheme, pretty much all of our competitors, bar none, furloughed their entire business development teams, and also quite a number of the firms have furloughed their surveyors from director level downwards.
Wow.
You know, so we've increased our capacity to approach new business, and at the same time, our competition is completely moved away. We don't really have any. So as a result, we've had 8 weeks of the most productive business development reaction that we've ever had. We're pitching more now than we ever have done. Now, I don't know when a lot of that work that we're winning is going to actually turn into money, because the transactions, it's too early to say, and the transactions aren't happening. But what we are doing is building pipeline.
Yeah.
And that is the point of business development.
And again, your conversion ratios might be shot to pieces. They might end up doubling, but fundamentally, if you're filling the hopper, you've got half a chance.
Yeah, and then it's about survival. You know, then it's about survival until the market shifts. You know, a lot of this is going to be about, like, a lot of the decisions that have been made over the last 8 weeks by companies are going to be the things that kind of determine their success or failure of the future. You know, and I think that, and this is a criticism to some companies, I think just because you have the opportunity to furlough people doesn't mean you should. I think a lot of these companies actually didn't need to do that. And I in that I see an opportunity, and at the moment we've avoided furloughs or pay cuts or anything like that, because the integrity of a business's brand is extremely important. You know, people want to be proud of where they work, and just suddenly finding yourself kind of disregarded because a company can save £2,500 a month just seems, you know, just doesn't sit brilliantly with me. Now that's not to say that we might not need to furlough or make redundancies in the future, but right now we're okay. Like we've done well in the recent past, and we're using that success to protect our employees. You know,
I think that's a really strong message. You know, I think you're probably the first property company or company within in the London market that I've spoken to hasn't taken some advantage of the furlough scheme, and I think it's really encouraging. For us, we've found, because ultimately we're a sales business, we're a recruiter, and we've transformed the way we've delivered our services. We've centralised. We have leaned down. We have used furlough, but with the Stew and Coco branding, we've completely revolutionised our product portfolio, and we're starting to get some traction. And the interesting thing for me is, in terms of what we're doing, how we're doing it, it's a bit innovative. But in terms of the core message, it hasn't changed from the last recession or the recession before that or the recession before that. Yeah. And for me, the survivors and the companies that will thrive over the next year and from then on are those that upskill. They use this opportunity, right? They use this as an opportunity to upskill their existing staff with new skills. Right. And again, furlough allows us to do that. We've got coaching going on this week with existing employees, but also to go and secure your competitors' best people, because whilst like you found, whilst companies are flailing around and we need to furlough, everybody needs to furlough. Well, actually, you don't need to. And it's companies like yours that are trailblazing in the sector, that those top 10, top 20% of individuals will want to come and join.
I think there's a lot to be said for that. I mean, I know from our discussions in the past that, you know, we've had some similar issues about securing really high caliber people. Yeah. Because a lot of when you're an emerging business, you know, you're relatively young as a business, and you don't have the kind of track record that people seem to need in order to feel comfortable working in a company like that, like SHB. I think that problem is now going to go away, because actually the irony is that the protective blanket of a massive brand, actually, I realized this some time ago, that actually you're more at risk in that environment than you are in ours. Yeah. Because, you know, somebody in a big company, it's all great when things are going well, and you can go to your dinner events and what have you, and you can boast about, you can be a part of this great brand, but there's no transparency. And when the markets get tight like this and the uncertainty floods in, which is what has happened, and furloughing and redundancies and pay cuts just kind of magnify that enormously, suddenly the loyalty and the faith that one person had in that brand is kind of been completely evaporates, because they realize that they're completely exposed. And if somebody at high power says, make X pounds worth of savings, I don't care how you do it, then the loyalty going towards the employee, well, you suddenly have a very hard lesson that there isn't any, you know, and or it's in that environment there isn't much of it. And, you know, and that's a tough lesson. And, you know, that's why actually recessions and downturns like this are extraordinarily natural events, first of all, because, like, you know, with every up, there is a down. You know, we don't live in this world where it's different. You know, this generation is different. I used to believe that, you know, when I started, I thought, yeah, it's different for us. You know, the Gordon Brown and the Blair era, and you realize it wasn't. Yeah, all of that.
We've got new, you know, macroeconomic tools.
Yeah, they didn't understand it like we do. All that kind of stuff. So there's because we've had an an upturn really since 2008, 9, 10, through, you know, things like quantitative easing have put off recessions to, if you could argue it,
money
like
printing,
money printing. You know, you could argue it like that. It means that we've got a whole generation of people who, if we're honest, and they get called millennials, but the word millennial embodies so many things, and it's become a misused word probably overall. But what this recession is going to do, this downturn will be a very positive thing. It will teach everyone of all ages, whether they've never experienced it before or whether they have. It's going to remind them that there's a humility about that people need in order to be good business people, whether it's a man or a woman. You know, you need to respect that this is a very aggressive kind of financial world we live in. And it often can be extremely cruel. It can also be very kind, you know, when things are going gangbusters and we're all having a brilliant time and the restaurants and the pubs are all full and we're going on 2 or 3 holidays a year and we've got a few cars and all that kind of stuff. But that's not really normal life. You know, we've lived a bit of a lucky existence for quite some time. And this is going to be a very harsh reminder. And that's going to hurt a lot of people. You know, there's going to be a great deal of redundancies in our country. You know, we've seen it happen in the States, you know, where they didn't furlough people. Here, when we come to the end of our furlough scheme, it's highly likely that a large portion of those people who have taken advantage of that, or their employers have taken advantage of the scheme, won't have a job.
Well, we were talking potentially, weren't we, that you could end up with unemployment comfortably reaching, you know, early 80s type, possibly even double digits.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. Like the worst. I mean, this is something that there doesn't seem to be a lot of connection with this at the moment. But the worst, if you go back through the recessions in kind of order, like we went, you know, 2000 with banking crisis, 2008, 9, 10. Before that, you know, dot-com, and then before that, it was the late 80s recession where, you know, the anecdote that people love to bring up in that one is the interest rates went up to 16 or 17%.
Yeah, 15, 16%. Yeah.
And everybody always backs that up and says, well, that won't happen again. And of course it won't. That's right. But the price of property, I mean, this is very relevant because this recession will affect every single person in the UK community. It won't miss anybody. Unlike the banking crisis,
and also the world community, lest we forget, this will be you know, it's a global pandemic. It will likely be a global recession.
Oh, no doubt about it. But the human negative impact at home in the UK will not be the same as what happened in the banking crisis, because that was a terrible financial crisis on paper, but it didn't mean that you saw the kind of human reaction in society that you did in the late 80s. Now, what happened in the late 80s was that people just couldn't afford to pay their mortgages. They couldn't afford to feed themselves.
And you had a massive, exactly as you said, you had a massive price correction property dropped 40, up to 40, 50% in many cases, right? Whereas QE during the last recession basically kept asset prices reasonably steady.
It was a pretty quick
It was a
dead
bit of a
cat
bounce.
Yeah, wasn't it? Yeah. And this time, I mean, I know this is a subject that one has to be a bit careful about talking about, because, there's talking down markets and talking ourselves into recessions. But I look at this now as a discussion about being realistic. You can't have that many people spiking in terms of unemployment and not expect there to be other reactions to that, such as a housing crisis. Now, interest rates don't need to go up to, we've got the opposite problem. Interest rates are lower than they've ever been, but house prices are also way, way higher than they've ever been. And if interest rates went up to 3 or 4%, you'd probably have a similar reaction to the one you had in the late 80s.
Yeah. And also with public sector borrowing requirements globally, huge amounts of debt needing to be sourced.
Yeah,
I would argue you will see a serious upshift in interest rates, because I can't see how you can't. I can't see where there's that much excess liquidity floating around.
The money that we're using at the moment has to come from somewhere,
doesn't
it? And interest rates, they've allowed estate agents to get going again a few days ago, and one has to imagine that that's to try and get the engines of the housing community pumping again. But it'll be really interesting to see how that impacts in terms of value. But this isn't the misconception about a recession like this, or what we're looking at, is that we're looking at something that will correct itself within 6 to 12 months. We haven't even started to feel the financial damage, like really. It's there, and but you just don't know how bad it is, because you haven't been able to look at the landscape.
The market's been put on hold. It's not been allowed to start moving again. At which point, how deep is the drop going to be?
Absolutely. And somebody the other day made a brilliant analogy. It was perfect. It's like we're in the midst of a tsunami, and it hasn't retracted yet. So you can't see and survey the damage. Yeah, I thought that was perfect, because, but it also has a load of other connotations, because recessions are actually, the virus is terrible, and that's tragic in every single which way, which is another subject altogether. But a recession, although it causes harm to people financially and through mental illness and things like that these days, which we understand more, actually the end result of a recession is entirely positive. You end up with it's a very natural event. It's necessary.
Hopefully young people will be able to afford homes again.
Well, things like that, retail, which you touched on before. The retail's been in a terrible state for a number of years. Suddenly you could argue it's being put out of its proverbial misery, and you'll end up with a new generation of retailers who start to emerge and come through.
Or those old retail spots which have been protected for years artificially by planning departments. You're going to have to do something with them now.
Starts to loosen up a bit, positive things, the airline industry. I mean, that's got an awfully sad journey ahead of it. But in the end, you might end up with more carbon efficient, fleet, better run airlines. They're very outdated, these organisations. The NHS, is shown itself to be just the wonderful thing that it is, and always has been. This isn't new. I think maybe we just took it for granted to some degree. But, now hopefully this might revolutionise the way that we think about NHS and how important it really is, and how much money it really needs in order to make it function. The companies that are being born right now out of this situation are going to be the leaders in their industry for the next 20, 30 years. That's a nice thing to think about in the midst of a lot of very unpleasant things.
Yeah, I agree, and I do think it will be the individuals and the businesses that can evolve and thrive now, and certainly over the next year, that will be, possibly the unicorns of the
Yeah.
next decade,
And that is that I know it's a horrible state of affairs and situation we find ourselves in. It's very complicated. It's going to have horrible repercussions for people. But there are some really strong reasons to be optimistic. Now we're going to go through the short, medium term pain, but at the end of it, ultimately we'll end up with some better things.
Yeah, and hopefully more awareness for the planet.
Yes.
On a final note, I would agree with you. My personal hope, and I was talking to a client about this yesterday, my personal hope is that we in Britain and in Europe, we use this in terms of, we look at existing supply chains. We look at how they failed us because they're global, right?
Yeah.
We look at how this pandemic has travelled, and we learn some lessons. And we use things like, in our industry, you've got great tools. You've got capital allowances, right?
Yeah.
Why doesn't the government revise capital allowances to look at helping stimulate British fabrication again? Right?
Yeah.
Tax breaks for British-made produce.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Why can't we look at public sector procurement and look at stimulate? Again, specifying British fabricated produce.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, a lot of that actually links in. If you think about the connection to it's such an odd period of time. We've been before Corona, we were, and it feels like a million years ago, we were embroiled in the Brexit debacle.
Yeah.
And so we've been in uncertain times for quite a long time now, and I think people are very tired of that. But as you say, the Brexit situation and our own medium and long-term reaction to Corona will actually link up nicely, because we've got to renegotiate a lot of our deals, which we haven't done so far, about imports and exports. And actually, if you tie that into trying to get them more focused on the British companies, because we now have to kind of retract like that to protect our own economy, then that could be a positive. Timing-wise, it's very good. We've kind of hit two timelines at the right time, and I don't think a lot of other countries have got that benefit.
I've got to say, I do hope so. I hope for positive things, and once we find a cure, and once we're through this, I've no doubt it will be a brighter tomorrow. Listen, Simon, I thank you very much for your time and input, and I hope to see you soon for a beer.
100%. Good to see you, Tony. See you later.